Good. Well, I'm starting off with this slide, which tells us where we are at the moment in terms of the increase in global temperature. As we know, the targeted increase of the COP is 1.5 degrees, and we apparently have a good 30 years in order to keep it within 1.5 degrees centigrade. As you can see, we've already reached that target. On land temperatures, the Arctic is tending to warm at least twice as fast as the global average, which you can see is currently 1 degree increase in temperature. Ocean temperatures are lagging behind a little bit, and nevertheless, the overall picture is dire, as that screen shows. Here is a slide which illustrates the rise in parts per million of carbon, CO2 in the atmosphere. And it also has there every COP meeting until the last one, which was 2 years ago, of course, before the pandemic. And I look at this graph and I think, if there's such a thing as cause and effect, we ought to stop having COP meetings. Because every time there's a COP meeting, this graph gets steeper and steeper, which shows that actually there's a lot of talk and not a huge amount of action, which of course is the political context of the whole dilemma. In 2009, my book on climate change was published, and as you can see, it doesn't appear to be terribly optimistic about the politics of climate change. I hope that I'm not going to make everybody into a complete pessimist with this talk, but I mean, there is so much to worry about, not least in the imagination and willingness of our politicians to address the subject. In this book, I identified 4 phases which I thought were analogous to the period before and including the Second World War. And these 4 phases I identified as follows. First of all, you've got denial, where the problem really doesn't exist. People are confused by mixed messages from, obviously fossil fuel lobbies and many politicians who simply don't want to engage with the subject. They were saying, for example, that the science wasn't clear, that there was debate, there was no consensus, despite the fact that that consensus 20 years ago was well established, but funded a lot by fossil fuel leaning think tanks, funded by, and particularly in America, not so much in this country, by the fossil fuel industry, the Koch brothers, well-known supporters of denialism. That was, I think, a phase at the very beginning of the 1930s, before the Second World War, when Hitler wasn't really seen as an issue at all. Anyway, here he is, and here you have the appeasers. So denial is beginning to wane, but the problem is felt can still be contained by appeasing it, by trying to engage with it in a way which doesn't involve sacrifice, except of little countries like Czechoslovakia. But as the problem gets worse, we move from appeasement into a phony war. Here I illustrate what I describe as the charlatans at their last great meeting in Cornwall for the G7. They talk a great fight, but sadly, as we've seen, and as we'll see later on in this slideshow, things are just going to carry on belly up if they don't actually start acting. So you have a lot of announcements, a lot of agreement that much must be done, and some things are being done. I mean, only today we have the government's announcement on the COP26 strategy for this country in terms of things like heat pumps and whatnot, heavily criticised for being inadequate. But this, they hope, will keep us as an electorate happy that nothing is going to terribly impact on our lives, that we will somehow be exceptional and we will escape the consequences of climate change. That's the phony war, where there does seem to be engagement, but it is inadequate. Finally, there is total war. This slide from a low cartoon back in 1940 does tend to ignore 50% of the population, but it is where politicians finally agreed that they had to act now, and act with absolute total seriousness, to the extent that when Churchill became Prime Minister in 1940, he involved the opposition in the government. Clement Attlee became Deputy Prime Minister, and elections were suspended. There should have been a general election in 1940 or 41, there wasn't. So everybody actually got behind this single great cause. And they did that without a huge amount of difficulty or debate. It was just seen as absolutely, utterly necessary. I wondered, I mean, here is, sorry to give everybody a shock with this photograph, but there was a debate in Parliament and the House of Commons on the 1st of May 2 years ago, where with a Labour motion on an Opposition Day debate, it was agreed that we had a climate emergency. Parliament agreed there was a climate emergency. And Michael Gove, who was winding up for the government at the end of that debate, said what you see on the screen, saying that a consensus really was necessary, that everybody had to put aside their differences politically and work together, which is a fine thing to say, but actually quite difficult to achieve. Back in 2006, the All Party Group, which I founded, the All Party Group on Climate Change, published a report asking, is a cross-party consensus on climate change possible or even desirable? And this is one of the difficult things about politics and democracy in particular. One could say that democracy is one of the biggest impediments to effective action on climate change, because if we really are serious about it, it's not just some technology that might do the deal. It is actually asking the voters to make behavioural changes, possibly sacrifices, and no politician wants to do that. It's easier in opposition to say we're all in favour of consensus, because then you want the government to share some of its power with you. Governments tend not to want to share power with any of the other parties if they can possibly avoid it, because if things go well, they'll take the credit for it. I presented this report to Tony Blair in 2006, and nothing happened. We had a huge majority. And here's another example, which I plucked off the internet from the New York Times a few days ago. You may be aware that Senator Joe Manchin from West Virginia is really trying to diminish Joe Biden's climate change agenda. It should be said that Senator Manchin, who is a Democrat, is also got interest in the fossil fuel industry, and West Virginia is America's largest coal-producing state. He also shares the other seat in the Senate with a Republican, who is also vehemently opposed to clean electricity and all the rest of it, and spending taxpayer money on basically phasing out fossil fuels. So they have a very good example of two people from two different parties actually sharing an agenda to spoil the bigger agenda, tackling climate change. And these are the kind of considerations that a lot of MPs will have. MPs representing old coalfield areas, MPs representing areas with nuclear power stations. They all tend to follow the local consensus, which favours employment and things of that nature. And it should be noted, and especially 15 years ago when I was in Parliament, that there was no constituency interest for renewable energy because it was spread out all over the place, unlike a nuclear power station, which basically almost controls the MP, regardless of party. Back to the one of my original slides. This is now superimposed with a black line, which you can see there is fossil fuel burning related to construction and everything else that we use fossil fuels for. And that line is projected to go up even steeper. And here's how it's going to happen. This slide shows you how clean energy, fossil fuel energy investment and other energy investments are looking in the post-pandemic recovery period. These are the top 20 economies in the world. If you look down there to the UK, despite today's announcement, you can see that the fossil fuel investments, that this is from public money that will be made in this country, are second only to the United States. We exceed Chinese fossil fuel investments, but you'll hear a lot in the coming 2 or 3 weeks about really it's China that's the big problem. China has to solve its addiction to fossil fuels and so on. And yet we will be exceeding them in absolute terms in investment. Investment then is clearly all about business as usual, and all the talk that we're getting today from this government, and I dare say previous governments, we're not blameless, is in many cases just a lot of hot air. That's the really bad news. And moving on, I will be in COP and just for a couple of days. Spend some of the time, I hope, to be handing out this leaflet. You don't have to read it all now if you don't want to or can't, but the proposal that I support to tackle the climate change crisis is a framework called Contraction and Convergence. Everybody talks about getting to net zero or to zero by 2050. Some people talk about equity, how we share the problem globally, but politicians tend to avoid that question if they can, because the suggestion that people in the developing world and the poorest people in the world who will face the worst consequences of climate change should have some kind of equitable stake in this process, and it's us that cause the problem, is still anathema in many places, particularly in the United States. So there has to be some form of equity if we're going to get everybody signed up to an agreement that really provides the discipline to achieve our goals. And the word discipline is one which politicians don't like to use. It goes back to this idea of sacrifice and all the rest of it. You don't want to win an election on the back of saying to the electorate that they're going to have to be disciplined. But I'm afraid the consequences of not doing that are a lot worse. So the contraction and convergence model has been around for a long time, since COP3. The Chinese were quite keen on it at COP15. So that's, Copenhagen, I think, was COP15. And they wanted to push that agenda forward, but the West, and particularly the United States, didn't want to do anything that would impact on their voters. The consequence of contraction and convergence at a more domestic level is something that I moved a private member's bill on. It didn't get anywhere, although the subject was discussed in Cabinet once on a list of other options. And this was originally called Domestic Tradable Quotas. I would prefer to use the phrase personal carbon allowances. So every year, every individual would be given an allowance of CO2. Every year that allowance would go down according to the science. So if we said, for the sake of argument, that we were currently each emitting or responsible for 10 tons of CO2 and it had to be zero by 2050, then you can work out a way of reducing it. But you could also say in the same policy that if you don't use your full allowance, you can sell the surplus. So, that would give a bit of flexibility to the system. So maybe if you were only using public transport and you didn't fly away on holidays and all that kind of thing, and you had some surplus, people who did do those things would be able to purchase it. But the overall total, based on 10 tonnes each, and then maybe 9 tonnes next year and 8 tonnes the following year, the overall total would continue downwards. That would be equitable, it would be redistributive, and part of the problem with it is that some people would call it socialist, so that's not going to go anywhere at all. If you want to learn more about contraction and convergence, just look for gci.org. If we had got that framework in place all those years ago, we would be much further advanced in our fight against climate change. I'm not expecting anybody to read all of this. I'm just thinking about local actions that we can take as individuals. This is the text. As I say, you don't have to read it, because if you want to use it, I can send it out as a template, and perhaps we can talk about that after I've finished, which I'm just about to do. Here's a number of questions which I prepared for my local MP, Robert Goodwill. Questions about his voting in the House of Commons on various things. Questions about whether he believes in cross-party consensus, how he will do more on climate change as a priority in his own political work. He didn't even mention it in his last leaflet. How he responds to the Climate Change Committee, which supposedly sets targets and reports on the government's progress, which reports that it's pretty dire so far. How many homes in his constituency he imagines will benefit from these grants for heat pumps and whatnot. Also, I looked at his voting record through theyworkforyou.com, and you can see there on the left how he voted on a number of climate change related issues. These are tools which I think, if you do have a conservative, or this is a template for a letter, if you do have a conservative MP, you could send and then demand answers, maybe get some publicity, maybe meet that person and demand answers. Obviously, I'm from a political background, and we often leave it too late at the local level to challenge our opponents. We wait until there's an election when they're only candidates. My view now is that we have to really come in quite heavy, particularly with Conservative MPs, because they're in power, about what they're going to do about climate change in their locality. And that might generate local stories for the local press and radio and whatnot, and for social media. Obviously, we don't go around to their offices with knives. We take to our pens and demand answers. So hopefully, if any of you have Conservative MPs in wherever your home was or is, do get in touch if you want to use this as a template for tackling them locally. So I think that's about it. I hope we'll have a lively question and answer session. I have a website which is there, blogging on all sorts of things, a lot of which is of no consequence whatsoever. So I will stop there.
Thank you so much, Colin. That was brilliant. Really interesting to hear. Yes, so due to my high levels of stress at the beginning, I forgot to mention it, but we're now entering the Q&A section, which I have informed people who are here of. So if anyone has any questions for Colin, please feel free. So you can raise your hand, you could put them in the chat, or if you'd like to take them personally, please just raise your hand or let me know. I will happily start us off whilst people think of things to say. I'm interested, you talk about how we need individual responsibility and individual action. Do you have any thoughts about how you would, obviously there you talk about incentives, for example, like having this kind of carbon allowance. Is there any other ways that you would think of being able to actually, convince people or incentivize people to, say, for example, reduce their meat consumption, travel less, you know, ride their bike more, things like that. How as from a political strategy do you think we go about doing these sorts of things?
Well, I believe that individual and collective action at the same time is very important. We tend to get the message at the moment that it's from a lot of places, it's all down to the individual. Change your light bulbs, do this, do that. You know, we were telling people to change the light bulbs when actually the replacement light bulbs were very expensive. Now we've been told to change from gas boilers to heat pumps, you know, which are 3 or 4 times as expensive. And electric vehicles, it's the same. So it always seems to come down that, well, you can do this if you've got a bit of money. And a lot of people just can't afford to do this sort of stuff. There are 1.5 million homes that are extremely difficult to insulate. I happen to live in one of them, a solid brick construction in a conservation area. Where do you put your insulation? So the government does have to act. It has to have good regulations that make it easier for people to do things individually, but it also has to introduce a proper level of grant support, or you know, even loans, to do realistic things. If more people bought renewable energy on renewable energy tariffs, I know at the moment it's a bit of a hot subject, then that would be a good thing. But how do you get them to do that? I mean, you can incentivize things by maybe reducing to zero the VAT on renewable energy provided to homes, give it that economic competitive advantage. There should be more support for industry. Sadly, when I was in Parliament, the then Labour government had a policy of not backing winners. That was the actual phrase used. So if you had a potentially good new technology, the government would say, well, the market will take care of that. This is what Boris Johnson is also saying, in effect, is that the market will sort out the problem by deciding itself which is the best technology and which could be the quickest one. It doesn't actually believe in it because it's also proposing a set of new mini nuclear power stations. And as anybody who studies the economics of nuclear power, it has never stood up on its own in the private sector. Even Nigel Lawson, when he was Chancellor, found that nuclear power was just an impossible thing to privatise because it doesn't stack up economically. So it's down to government to do a great many of these big decisions, to create the incentives for industry, the markets and individuals to do their individual things. When it comes to meat, as a vegetarian, I would love to see more people not eating meat. There are other ways that you can maybe persuade people on that front. And that, I think, is really quite a big debate, a very hot subject. And maybe somebody has some thoughts on it.
I've muted myself. Someone has raised their hand. I'm not sure if that's in reference to what has been said, what you've just said. What I'll do is I'll just open it up to you, Ross, to allow you to talk, to ask your question. And then I've got a few more questions that have been put in the chat that I'll then relay to you, Colin, afterwards. So Ross, there you go. You should be able to speak.
Yeah, hi. Yeah, my question isn't in relation to the last one, but kind of a standalone thing. I'm not sure if you've read Tim Jackson's book, Prosperity Without Growth.
I've not read that one, no.
Well, I kind of recently read it, and if I could give you kind of rough overview of what he was saying, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts about it. Essentially, the point that he was getting at is that politicians from both parties have had their hands tied for the past 40 years by the requirement for continued economic growth year on year for the economic system to stay stable. And that if we're going to create a sustainable world, it's quite difficult to imagine doing that with the economy continuing to grow every year, because as quickly as we decarbonize each unit of economic activity, the size of that economic activity grows, and it's really difficult to decarbonize at a faster rate than the economic growth happens. I guess what I'm interested in about it is this kind of idea that we need to create an idea of what the good life means for an individual and for society as a whole that is fundamentally not linked to material consumption, that we need to get away from the kind of measure of saying more GDP is more value, and define a kind of new direction as a culture that we want to travel in, that isn't linked to those metrics. Because to me it seems that until we can decouple what it means to have a good life from those metrics, we're going to be fighting the fire on one hand and fueling it on the other hand. With if you look at recently the policies that are coming out to stimulate the high street, stimulate consumption in response to the COVID pandemic, when you've had this year where kind of it's the first year that emissions have meaningfully fallen, and then the government creates holiday policies to drive them back up through increased consumption, which you can understand the logic of it, but whilst that logic remains in place, then I don't see how things can change. But yeah, I don't know if you think that's, yeah.
I think there's a great deal of truth in what you've said, and obviously what this book that you've mentioned conveys. It's a problem that many economists and even some politicians have tried to grapple with it. I remember David Cameron very early on saying that we should measure things with some kind of happiness index, and then obviously contributed nothing to bring about happiness. I mean, the problem with our current GDP is that it measures every form of economic activity. Oh, sorry, one of the problems with GDP is that it does that. If I went out tomorrow and had a car crash, that would create economic activity. So, you know, we could all go out and have a car crash and our GDP growth would go up, which is clearly absurd. So we do need another measure of what it is that drives our economy, and it should be something about how good our lives are, and quite how to achieve that when politicians and economists, even those economists who can see the problem, are very loath to walk away from our current model of growth based on this GDP model. Because it's hard to see. I mean, sometimes I grapple with this issue in terms of, let's talk about Bangladesh, which has a huge reliance on its clothing factories. People in poverty, it's the only way they can earn a living, many of them. If we start saying that we're just going to recycle our clothes or reduce our purchase of clothes by, say, 50%, because we can make them last longer, etc., etc., does that mean that we compensate Bangladeshis for their loss of trade? What's going to be the impact on employment? So everything we do is going to have an impact, and we should prepare for it. So we should be able to say, well, if we're going to stop buying from you what you produce and what you depend on, we're going to have some responsibility to answer their question, which is, well, you supported global trade, you wanted us to do all this, and now you're just abandoning us. We have to answer that question.
Yeah, and I think that for as long as it remains not being talked about, it's kind of this massive problem that is the kind of secondary effect of the changes that we need to make. And it has been seen on the horizon, and it really needs a structured response, because reducing consumption within the current system lead to a massive amount of suffering and kind of for the system to collapse. So if it could be done, if there weren't a lot of kind of political barriers to it, even if it were kind of politically tenable,
it needs to be managed in a framework that takes all of these things into account. The Contraction and Convergence framework, which is redistributive by its very nature, because it's based on equity as well as the science. If that could be agreed, then everybody would benefit, apart from perhaps the wealthier in the world, who would have to adjust their lifestyle. I mean, they're going to have to adjust their lifestyle anyway. I mean, one of the consequences of climate change is that many millionaires' homes or billionaires' homes in California, they'll be breathing in smoke every day, and no doubt they'll just buy more air conditioners or something. But it's impacting on everybody. And one of the things that we in the West, I think, have thought too long, perhaps subconsciously, is, well, this climate change thing is going to impact on the poorer parts of the world first, the tropical regions and such like. We're now seeing it's affecting the richest country in the world on a big scale, with floods, fires, drought. The Midwest is drying up, and that's going to have consequences for the politics. But the question is, how long do we have to wait before they wake up?
Thank you so much for your question, Ross. That's really interesting. And just before I go, just really quickly, would be interested to know, Colin, what you think about. I know that the Green Party, whilst quite small, I'm a big advocate of them, and they have been talking about the idea of a well-being economy metric rather than a GDP metric, which would still incorporate kind of economic activity, but would kind of weight it based on the what's the word for it, like quality of life and everything that comes alongside it. I'd be interested to know just quickly what you think about that and what your thoughts are on the Green Party as well.
I think on that particular subject of a well-being index, I think it would be useful to have anyway, and perhaps somebody is already working on it somewhere. The question is, what does it change? We can have different ways of measuring success or failure in these terms, but what does that measurement actually change is the big question. What activity does it lead to? And I can refer back to my previous answer, what consequences then does that activity have on somewhere else? I don't know how the Green Party addresses that. I'll have to look into it. I think the Green Party is a very good thing on that subject. We do need, well, in my view, this is what Robin Cook, the Labour MP, used to say, we need a red-green solution, because a lot of the policies, you could say they are socialist and as well as environmental. It's not just environment per se, looking out on a lovely landscape and preserving it. It's also about the activities of we humans in our industry and in our relations with each other. And all of those things have to be recognised, I think. I don't know to what extent the Green Party does that. The Labour Party's background, obviously I'm a Labour Party member, has always been concerned with the social economy. I would never describe it as a Green Party. Only recently has it got a green tinge, you might say. Always very vocal, but quite small. It was more interested in health and education and those sorts of things. We need a marriage of the two things, because you can't have good health systems and education systems if the environment is collapsing. And now we're beginning to realise that we aren't exceptional as we always thought we were. Perhaps this would be a good point to recommend a book which I've just been reading, a psychology book of all things, which is called, by Sally Weintraub, Psychological Roots of the Climate Crisis, Neoliberal Exceptionalism and the Culture of Uncare. I'd recommend that because I think this concept of exceptionalism, somehow we're special and these things won't affect us and we can go on as normal. That pervades our society in such a strong way. It's quite difficult to see exactly how it's going to be eradicated, least of all in the sphere of politics.
That's interesting what you say about the Labour going more green, because I think also the Greens are going a bit more socialist as well, or at least I think that marriage that you demand, I think, is happening on both sides. So
I think it's very welcome, and in Germany we're likely to see the Greens back in government. I welcome that because it provides more balance in the whole debate and hopefully in policies too.
So moving on to some of the other questions that we've received, I'll start off with a question from Dorothy Cowie, who's one of our Ps here in the university. asking, how can we get government to change their major policies? There's writing to your MP at one end of the spectrum and gluing yourself to the road at the other. What do you think is most effective? And thanks for a great talk.
I think this on the last point about the recent action of Insulation Rebellion, I don't think that's actually going to work. I understand the feelings of the people. I sound like Prince Charles here. I understand the feelings, but I don't agree with the tactics. I don't agree with the tactics because it immediately puts people off. Even if you aren't affected in a hold-up on the M25, you can see it on TV and you think, well, what would I do if I was facing this and I was going to be late for an appointment, or an emergency ambulance is going to be held up, or the rest of it? I mean, I think that does put people off. I'm certainly in favour of demonstrations and everything, and I've been to quite a few myself when I was an MP. But I think at this particular moment in time, if we have a Conservative MP, these people are in power. The Labour Party isn't, sadly, or not, depending on your viewpoint. Those MPs, those Tory MPs, should come under severe pressure, intellectual, not violent or anything, to start answering for their policies and their votes. So when they voted, well, actually, they didn't have a vote on the emergency, the climate emergency. That was passed without any dissent. There was no vote, which really, means that every MP must have been in favour of it, if you see what I mean. They have to be held to account for this. This is an emergency. What are they going to do? And one has to be persistent with them until you're a bloody nuisance. Let's not wait for an election. Let's be a nuisance now. I'm starting off with this letter, and I would take it very seriously if I was still an MP. But it can be followed up. The thing is, it has to be followed up over and over and over and over again, whereas gluing yourself to the road may not be something that can be repeated that often. And it's only ever going to be done by a handful of people. So your local Tory MP has to be the target.
Thank you so much. Tony Wainwright would like to jump in just in the chat and say that it was Insulate Britain who glued them, who were the ones seen on the roads. Not. No problem. I know that he's part of XR, I think, in some way. So he's defending his people. I
would say to those people as well, particularly to XR, get behind contraction and convergence. It's okay saying, well, we'll have a bit of this technology, we'll have a bit of that technology. Very few people seem to add up what that is actually going to do to alter the position. And it can lead into arguments about what is the UK contribution to climate change. I mean, it's about 1%. So people will say, well, what's the point anyway doing all of this stuff, because we're only 1%. Whether you look at the population of 60 million people anywhere, they're only going to be 1%. So it all adds up. It has to be everybody. And I don't think XR have actually grappled with contraction and convergence. They really ought to.
Someone else pointing out Insulate Britain and XR are different things. I think different. You were aware of that, yeah. Okay, yeah. So going back to Tony, he also had a question, which was, do you think that the Citizens' Assemblies type of approach has a role in changing local and national government approaches?
I think it's a useful approach. There has been one on climate change, and that can feed into policy. Sometimes, I mean, you sometimes might wonder how people are chosen to be on these things, and how you have proper consultation. I mean, if you have 100 people in a room, you will get a very good conversation going. But it's the other 60 million that we need to think about as well. So how then, if you have some sensible things coming out of a citizens' assembly, how then do you promote those ideas to the wider public? That is another issue which is it bedevils a democracy. Sometimes you might think, wouldn't it be nice just to have a benevolent dictator that just makes all these things happen? And I remember in my first university degree, Hull University, doing philosophy, I did question the value of democracy, which is a bit ironic due to my subsequent career.
Yeah, okay. One final question then I have. I see we've run a little bit over time. I hope you're not rushing off to get anywhere. So last question then is from Ezekiel. Rather than avoiding meats completely, would it be better to avoid certain meats that are worse for the environment due to the benefits of consuming meat?
If your approach is about climate change, then I think you would target those animals which produce the most methane. So you're looking at cattle, basically. And I don't know how much they contribute in this country, but if you look at Brazil, it's a double whammy because the rainforest is being burnt down to create land to grow soya and also to graze cattle and for beef and so on. So the cost in climate change terms of that bit of protein is enormous. And as we know, the amount of protein you get from 1 ton of beef probably requires 14,000 tons of grain or plant protein to make it happen, never mind the water content. So there could be different approaches if one wanted to be scientific about it. The reason I became a vegetarian has nothing to do with climate change. It's just about our inhumane practices in abattoirs, which if anybody wants to go and visit an abattoir, not many people do, they'll probably come out as a vegetarian at the very least, if not a vegan.
I have had one more question which you can answer very quickly, and then we'll call it quits, which is just what do you feel would be an effective strategy for getting the government to tell the truth about the actual danger? So and about the actual time frame that danger is bound to. That's from Brennan Holt. How do we actually get them to tell the truth? Like you say, if we're still in this phony war stage where they're kind of accepting it, kind of not. How do we get them to actually admit what the problem, that there is a problem, that there is a crisis beyond just saying there's an emergency?
Well, yeah, going back to those 4 stages of the build up to total war, I would say that in relation to that question, the thing that brought total war on was Hitler's expansion of his aggression to Norway, particularly at that time, and obviously to France. That's when it became such an immediate problem that the politicians had to tell the public the truth, that it was going to be a very bad business. So I'm afraid to say that the only thing that might do the trick in our society will be some climate change disasters. Climate change with a little toothbrush moustache on it. We'll have to do something so bad for us to start making the change. But as we've seen in the States, with all the floods, fires and drought, there are still politicians resisting change, and a lot of them, not just a handful. So really, I can't answer the question in any other way than that, which is to say, they won't tell us everything that we need to know, because they would then have to do a damn sight more to tackle the problem.
Thank you very much. We've already got some people coming in the chat saying thanks for your talk, and thanks for the presentation, and agreeing that we need to get involved in the politics of all of this. So on that note, I think we will, more thank yous coming through. I think we'll end it there. Thank you so much from me and from
If I could just briefly interject, if anybody wants the template for that letter to their Conservative MP, contact me through the website, colinchallen.org.
Yeah, great.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Colin. Really appreciate that. And thank you to everyone who came along. And if you know of other people who would be interested in this talk but weren't around and able to watch it now, we do have, we will be recording, this is being recorded, and we will be putting it up onto the YouTube, and I will send a link out to all of the attendees via the email. So you can find the link there, and then you can go watch it and share it around and let people know about it. And please let people know about the P talks, because we have one a month planned for at least the next 5 months. So there's going to be a lot of interesting stuff. And if you are a member of the Ps, I've also just been reminded that we need to discuss a date for holding our first general Ps meeting of the academic year. So if they could email me or the Ps account with a preference about time, I'll deal with that outside of this, because there's non-Ps in the chat right now. But so I'll just leave it there. So thank you so much again, Colin, and thank you for coming, and hope you enjoy the rest of your evening.
And you.
Thank you.